The Ontario Trappers, Night Act 1, The Frozen Silence, Northern Ontario, 1897. Winter ruled with an iron fist, the kind of winter that silenced rivers and snapped trees in half, that froze a man's breath before it left his lips. Out here, the cold wasn't just weather, it was a predator, waiting to sink its teeth into anyone foolish enough to wander too far without preparation. Ethan Cole trudged through knee-deep snow, his trap slung across his back and a canvas sack heavy with the day's catch. Rabbits, a fox. Nothing extraordinary, nothing to boast about. Just enough to keep him fed and to barter with the trading post when he'd make the week-long journey back to town. At 42, Ethan looked older than his years. Solitude does that to a man. His face was lined, beard rimmed with ice, and his pale blue eyes held that distant, hollow stare of someone who spent more nights listening to the wind than to human voices. He knew this forest, every ridge, every frozen creek, every hidden hollow, but tonight the woods felt different. Each step forward was echoed by the crunch of snow. Except sometimes, it wasn't just his steps he heard. He stopped, heart knocking against his ribs, listening. Behind him, silence. The kind of silence that rang louder than sound. "You're just tired," he told himself, hitching the sack higher on his shoulder. The forest plays tricks in the dark. Still, he couldn't shake it. That prickle on the back of his neck. That sense, deep, primal, that something was watching him from between the black trunks. He picked up his pace, boots sinking into the crusted snow. His cabin wasn't far now. A mile, maybe less. If he could just get the fire going, pour himself a cup of coffee, the unease would melt away with the frost on his beard. But the forest had other plans. Somewhere behind him, faint but distinct, snow shifted, not like a fox darting through underbrush, not like a wolf padding on silent paws. This was heavier, slow, deliberate. Ethan's breath clouded the air as he froze in his tracks. Then, silence again. He swallowed, forced his legs to move, and didn't stop until the squat shape of his cabin broke through the tree line ahead. The cabin greeted him like an old friend. Rough-hewn logs, roof piled with snow, smoke hole crusted with frost. Ethan shoved the door open, the hinges creaking like old bones, and stepped inside. The air inside was as cold as the woods, but safer somehow. He dropped his sack onto the table, unshouldered his rifle, and lit the oil lamp. Warm amber light pushed back the dark, spilling across the single room. A narrow cot, a cast-iron stove, shelves lined with jars of beans and jerky, and a desk scattered with trapping tools. Ethan knelt by the stove, striking a match to the kindling. Fire flared, popping and spitting, filling the room with heat that slowly began to thaw the numbness from his fingers. But the sense of being watched hadn't thawed with it. He poured himself a tin mug of coffee from the pot he'd left on the stove that morning. The bitter taste grounded him. Still, he found himself pausing mid-sip, listening, and then he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the wind didn't sound like that. A low rasp, wet, ragged, like something huge struggling to breathe through lungs packed with ice. Ethan froze, mug halfway to his lips, and set it down carefully. He crossed to the window, wiping a circle clear in the frost with his palm. The clearing lay bathed in moonlight. Snow draped every branch, every fence post. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, movement. A figure. Tall. Too tall. gaunt, bones pressing sharp against its skin, if it was skin at all. Its limbs were wrong, too long, bending at strange angles. It stood at the edge of the tree line, motionless, as though carved from the night itself. Ethan's stomach turned to ice. Every story he'd heard whispered around Cree campfires came rushing back. The Wendigo, a creature born of hunger. Once human, some said, until winter and famine twisted them. Now cursed spirits of the north, driven to consume endlessly, never satisfied. Tall as the pines, starved as death, and it was watching him. Even from this distance, he could feel its gaze, a heatless fire boring through the glass, through his skin, into his bones. Then it smiled. The mouth stretched impossibly wide, lined with jagged teeth like shards of ice. Ethan staggered back, rifle already in his hands. His heart slammed against his ribs, the echo of it loud in the tiny cabin. When he looked again, the clearing was empty. Ethan's hands shook as he gripped the rifle. The cabin walls suddenly felt too thin, the window too exposed, the door too flimsy to keep anything out. He moved to the center of the room, his breath quick, ragged. "Pull yourself together, Cole," he muttered under his breath. "It's just the dark, just a trick of the eyes." But even as he spoke, he didn't believe it. The legends had followed him his whole life. When he was a boy, the Cree hunters he sometimes traveled with had warned him. Do not stay too long in the deep woods. Do not trust the silence. And if you hear the Wendigo, run. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, carrying with it a smell that seeped through the cabin walls. A sour, rotting stench, like spoiled meat left too long in the sun. Ethan gagged, pulling his scarf over his nose. Then, knock, soft, at the wall behind him. He spun, rifle raised. Another knock, higher up this time, near the roof beams. Slow, deliberate. He backed toward the door, pulse thundering in his ears. He had two choices: barricade himself inside and pray the walls held, or run for it, gamble on the woods and the night. Before he could decide, a sound cut through the cabin like a blade. A voice. Not outside, not inside. Somewhere between. Thin. His name, drawn out, rasping, wrong. The rifle trembled in his hands. "Who's there?" His voice cracked in the middle, fear strangling the words. "Show yourself!" Silence. Then, again, closer, right against the window glass. Finn. He lunged forward and yanked the curtain aside. The thing stood inches away, its skull-like face pressed to the frost, mouth split in that hideous grin. Its eyes were pits of black, endless and starving. Ethan fired. The glass shattered, the roar of the rifle deafening in the small space. When the smoke cleared, the clearing was empty again. Only shards of glass glittered on the snow. But the stench lingered, stronger now, and the whisper came again, this time from the door. Ethan bolted the door, shoved the table against it, then dragged the cot on top for good measure. Sweat trickled down his face despite the cold. His every instinct screamed, "It wants in." The cabin shuddered as something massive slammed against the walls. The boards groaned. Dust sifted down from the rafters. Ethan fired blindly through the wood, each shot echoing into the night. For a moment, silence. Then laughter. Low, mocking. Human and not human at once. The boards at the roof split with a crack. A claw, long, bony, tipped with black ice, slid through, feeling its way inside. Ethan screamed, grabbed the hatchet from the stove, and swung. The claw withdrew, shrieking. The roof went still. Ethan stood panting, hatchet raised, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Minutes crawled by. Then, the whisper again, from inside the cabin. Ethan, so hungry. His blood froze. Slowly, he turned. The cot. The one he had shoved against the door. It shifted, just slightly, and then he saw it. A figure crouched beneath, thin as a corpse, its face a mask of bone and ash. The Wendigo. Inside. It moved faster than thought. One moment crouched, the next filling the room, impossibly tall, its head scraping the rafters. Its jaws opened wide enough to unhinge, teeth glinting in the lantern light. Ethan swung the hatchet. It sank deep into the creature's arm, but the Wendigo didn't even flinch. Its other hand clamped around his throat, lifting him as though he weighed nothing. Black spots swam before his eyes as it drew him close. The stench was overwhelming, rotten flesh and frozen blood. Hungry, it rasped again, voice rattling through bones rather than air. In a last, desperate act, Ethan jammed the rifle barrel against its chest and pulled the trigger. The blast filled the cabin with smoke and fire. The Wendigo screamed, a sound so piercing it shattered what glass remained. Ethan dropped to the floor, choking, scrambling for the door. When the smoke cleared, the cabin was empty. The Wendigo was gone. Or so he thought. At dawn, a search party from the trading post found Ethan's cabin in ruins. The roof was caved in, the walls clawed to splinters, the snow around it stained dark. But there was no body, only tracks. Human at first, bare feet in the snow. They led into the trees, and as they went, they changed. The toes elongated, the heel stretched. The prints grew wider, deeper, until they were no longer human at all. The tracks vanished into the endless forest. Weeks later, trappers whispered of a new figure roaming the woods near Ontario. Tall, gaunt, eyes like burning coals. And when the wind carried voices through the pines, some swore they heard it call a name. Ethan. The hunters of Minnesota, lost in the pines. The winter of 1920 in northern Minnesota was a merciless one. Snow lay in thick sheets across the pine forests, bending the branches to the ground. Rivers, normally alive with the sounds of water and ice, were frozen solid, forming crystalline paths that reflected the weak winter sun like fractured mirrors. Lakes gleamed beneath a coat of ice, jagged lines forming as if the ground itself had cracked under the cold. 3 hunters, Edward, Thomas, and William, were well acquainted with this harsh land. They were experienced men, hardened by years of tracking, hunting, and surviving in the unforgiving wilderness. Edward, the de facto leader, had a sharp mind and calm demeanor. Thomas, strong and stoic, often served as the moral compass. William, the youngest, was agile and reckless, often diving headfirst into danger. Together, they had braved the forests of Minnesota countless times, yet none of them could have anticipated what awaited in these northern pines. Their first day was uneventful. The men joked as they trudged through knee-deep snow, the rhythmic crunch of their boots the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. They shared stories, laughed at each other's clumsy falls, and occasionally glanced at the frozen rivers, imagining the deer tracks they hoped to follow. But by nightfall, something subtle shifted. The air seemed heavier. Even the wind had gone silent. The usual night sounds, owls calling, the distant howl of coyotes, were absent. Only the crackle of their fire filled the darkness. Thomas leaned close to the firelight, whispering, "Feels wrong, like the woods are holding their breath." Edward tried to shrug it off. "It's just the cold messing with your nerves," he said. Yet, when he scanned the shadowed tree line, he felt the uneasy sensation creeping up his spine. The forest was too quiet, almost as if it were watching. By the third night, even laughter had ceased. The men huddled near the fire, blankets drawn tight, rifles close. The dark forest pressed around them like a living thing, silent, patient, waiting. Morning brought more than the bitter chill. William, ahead of the others, froze mid-step. He bent down, brushing snow aside to reveal tracks. Enormous, far too long to be human. Each step pressing unnaturally deep into the ice-crusted ground. These can't be human," he said, voice barely audible. Edward knelt beside him, measuring with a gloved hand. "They're bigger than any man I've seen. Heavier, too. Whoever or whatever left these could crush a grown man without effort." And then the smell came, a vile, sweet stench that lingered on the air like smoke. It clung to their clothes and boots, making their stomachs churn. Nightfall brought something worse. It began as a high-pitched wail, distant at first. A sound that twisted and warped through the trees. Almost human. Almost. The men froze, rifles ready, hearts pounding in sync with the erratic rhythm of the sound. "Coyotes?" Edward asked, his voice tight. Thomas shook his head. "No, coyotes don't scream like that. Listen." The wail drew closer, then farther, circling them. Then came the whispers, barely audible at first, carried on the wind. Names. Each one unmistakably theirs. Edward. Thomas. William. Sleep was impossible that night. Each man lay awake, staring at the blackened tree line, imagining the shadows moving closer, listening to the wind, carrying voices that should not belong to the living. By the fourth day, desperation set in. Food supplies were dwindling. Tension thickened with the cold air. But it was William who changed first. He stopped speaking altogether. He refused food. At night, he would sit motionless, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the fire, lips moving silently, murmuring words no one could hear. Thomas grabbed his shoulder once, attempting to snap him back. William spun violently, eyes wide, teeth bared. "Don't touch me," he hissed, voice guttural, almost inhuman. The next night, Edward awoke to the sound of chewing, wet, sickening. He turned to see William crouched beside the dying embers of the fire, gnawing on a half-frozen deer leg. But the leg was blackened, rotting. Where had he found it? They hadn't seen any game in days. Edward gagged. "William, stop!" William looked up, eyes glinting unnaturally, voice low, strange. Hungry. By dawn, William was gone. No struggle. No sign of violence. Just empty bedroll, missing rifle, and tracks in the snow. Edward and Thomas followed for hours, calling his name. The tracks ended. They didn't double back. They didn't fade. They stopped abruptly, as if something had lifted him from the world itself. Night came, blacker and colder than before. The men didn't build a fire. They huddled, hearts pounding, rifles clutched tightly. Then, a presence stepped from the trees. Tall, gaunt, skin stretched tight across bones. Antlers spiraled from its skull. Eyes like burning coals. Teeth jagged and dripping, glistening in the moonlight. Its limbs bent unnaturally, moving with impossible silence. Edward fired his rifle. The gunshot split the night. Yet the creature didn't flinch, didn't stumble. It only grinned, and in a voice that sent Edward's blood cold, it whispered, in William's voice, "Hungry." Edward and Thomas ran blindly, snow lashing against their faces, lungs burning with exertion. Behind them, the forest seemed alive, shaking with laughter that was neither human nor animal. By dawn, Thomas collapsed. Edward tried to pull him up. "Come on, we can make it," he urged, desperation in his eyes. Thomas shook his head. "It wants me, not you." His voice was weak, almost distant. Edward refused to leave him, but by nightfall, Thomas was gone. Edward's tears froze on his cheeks. He staggered onward, alone, pursued not by a beast, but by the forest itself. Days later, a search party found him wandering near the forest edge. Clothes torn, eyes hollow, voice trembling as he recounted the horrors of William's change, of whispers in the trees. They didn't believe him. But at the camp, the truth was undeniable. Tents shredded, bones scattered, human remains cracked open, marrow sucked clean, and in the tree line, a tall figure lingered, antlers rising from its skull, eyes glowing faintly in the fading light. And as the wind shifted, the hunters heard a word they would never forget. Hungry, the cannibal of the North, the swift runner case. The year was 1879, and the northern plains of Alberta groaned under a cruel winter. Snow buried the forests, and the cold drove even the hardiest men to desperation. Among the Cree, there was a man named Swift Runner. Once he had been respected, a hunter, a guide, a father of 6. But in that year of famine, when food was scarce and the Hudson Bay Company's posts had little to offer, Swift Runner returned from the woods, changed. Neighbors whispered of it. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, yet burning with a feverish light. His frame, once strong, now seemed stretched thin, as though hunger had hollowed him from within. He spoke little. When he did, his voice was raw, as if he had been screaming at things only he could see. He complained of dreams, visions of a creature that stalked him through the pines. It whispered to him, promising meat when there was none, promising survival at a cost. The Wendigo, the elders said, he hears its call, but warnings were ignored. Swift Runner vanished into the woods that winter, taking his wife, his 6 children, and his mother-in-law with him. They built a camp deep in the forest, and that is where the nightmare began. At first, things were normal. Swift Runner hunted, setting traps and stalking deer. But game was scarce. Weeks passed, and the snares came up empty. His children cried at night from hunger. His wife's cheeks sank into sharp lines, her voice hoarse with pleading. And always the dreams. He would wake in the night to find himself standing outside the lodge, staring at the tree line, lips moving as though in prayer. But the words weren't prayers. They were whispers in a language his wife didn't know, guttural and wet, like the groaning of something half dead. "Come back to bed," she would beg. "You're frightening the children." But his eyes never left the trees. One night, she woke to find him crouched beside their eldest son, hand clamped over the boy's mouth, staring down at him as though he were not a child, but a meal. She screamed. Swift Runner staggered back, blinking, his face twisted with shame and confusion. He swore he didn't know what he was doing. He swore it was the Wendigo inside him, twisting his thoughts. The family clung tighter together after that, huddling by the fire, praying the famine would break. But the Wendigo's hunger only grew. The snow never stopped. Storm after storm buried the lodge. Swift Runner grew gaunt. His skin stretched thin over bone, yet his eyes gleamed with a terrible hunger. One by one, his family began to vanish. The neighbors would later recall how he returned to the village in spring alone. They would ask about his wife, his children, his mother-in-law. He said they were dead, taken by starvation. But the elders looked closer. His belly was round, not hollow. His cheeks flushed with meat. Not famine. Suspicion grew. The Northwest Mounted Police were called. They followed Swift Runner back into the woods, back to the camp where he had spent the winter. What they found froze their blood. Bones scattered around the lodge like refuse. Some snapped open, marrow sucked clean. Skulls caved in with hatchet blows. Small bones, children's bones, strewn in the snow. Swift Runner confessed. He had killed them, eaten them, and when asked why, he said only this: "The Wendigo made me die." Swift Runner was taken to Fort Saskatchewan, tried and sentenced to hang. But even as the gallows were built, people whispered. He did not look like a man condemned. He laughed. He sang. He told jokes with his guards. And the night before his execution, he whispered through the bars of his cell to the dark beyond. Witnesses swore they heard another voice answer. On the day of his hanging, Swift Runner mounted the scaffold calmly. He looked out over the crowd, eyes gleaming, and smiled. "I am no longer Swift Runner," he said. "I am the Wendigo's child." ... And when the rope snapped his neck, some swore they heard it, the sound of laughter, not from his lips, but from the forest beyond the walls. Even after his body was cut down, people reported strange things in the woods where his family had died. Shadows that followed them, a voice calling their names, bones unearthed where none should be. The Wendigo had not died with Swift Runner. It had only grown stronger. And in the stillness of a winter night, when the pines creak under their frozen weight, some trappers swear they hear it still. A voice, ragged and hollow, whispering from the trees, "Hungry."